Hi there. In this lecture we see our world chess champion Magnus Carlsen playing against Alexander Grishuk in 2021, the FTX Crypto Cup round 8. So Magnus chooses the seemingly disastrous path actually of Bent Larsen against Spassky. We see this move c4, a Fischer favourite as well, knight f6, now knight f3. Outrageous. Doesn't black just get a great game with e4? We have knight d4, bishop c5, so Magnus avoids knight takes c6. As Spassky has demonstrated, black has great compensation for the double pawns, which are largely unexploitable. Instead, we have this knight f5 move. Now, in fact, this move does actually signify an amplification strategy underlining the bishop on b2, or a magnification strategy. Use whatever synonym is most dramatic and effective for you. We want to make the most out of our bishop on b2. How do we do this? There are various techniques, various strategies and tactics. Taking out dark square pawns means that pieces are looser along this diagonal. Having pawns on our dark squares sometimes supports the bishop on key dark squares. So here, taking out g7 would weaken f6, for example, concretely. So this is a legitimate move. It does align with the idea of magnifying this bishop on b2. And I'm going to choose the word magnifying as the synonym because we're talking about Magnus magnifying. So anyway, so d5. Does Magnus magnify his bishop on b2 after d5? Let's first use this example game as to look at some analysis as well. d5 was played, but what about castling? Let's revisit and reinforce some technical analysis. e3 is possible here. And if d5, black has two threats to take our knight and potentially to play d4. We can address both with c takes d5. We're counterattacking the knight on c6. And if knight b4, there's knight g3. And white here is actually okay. This position is actually okay for white. We can play knight c3. We can play queen f3. Hitting d5. We're fine here. It's equal. If we look at this again, if knight d3 check, black's pushing their luck. We can take, and actually we can take out f6 to reinforce d5. And here we're actually doing really well. White's getting an advantage here. Very pleasant position indeed. So yes, these variations show that actually on castling e3 is okay. What we don't want to do is play something like g4 under any circumstance, because black has d4 and we're getting crushed. This is a way of us getting absolutely crushed. For example, this tactic for knight d3 check, knight takes b2, you could say goodbye to the position here for white. But yeah, as long as we're sensible here, there seems to be a playable position after c takes d5. So we want to counterattack the c6 knight. But anyway, black actually didn't castle. Black actually played d5. So Magnus did actually take on g7, and it does weaken dark squares in black's camp, amplifying our bishop along the diagonal. We see king f8, and here we see c takes d5 in this position. Now black chose bishop d4 here. Grishuk is a very strong super grandmaster. He chose bishop d4. If knight d4, e3 is possible. If king takes g7, e takes d4. Okay, we have trebled pawns, but appearances are part of a chess position. It's a functionality which really counts. After bishop d6, white can play knight c3, and after bishop f5, queen e2. And this position, for example, white can be really annoying with queen c4 and actually claim a small edge. This position, for example, we can play knight d1 to e3, and we can see that what's the matter with our position? There's nothing wrong with our position. We've actually got a clear advantage here, the way that black's played this, pushing their luck. If knight b4, a3, knight b takes d5, this position is reasonable as well for white. We have knight h5. Look at the pin on the diagonal. And you might think, well, the bishop's trapped, isn't it, after f6? Not really. Queen takes e4. Here, there's queen f3, and it's awkward for black, because if knight f4, e3, if knight g6, all of a sudden we're pinning that knight, which means f6 is not really protected, and our bishop's just escaped. Queen takes, which is going to take the queen. The knight can't recapture. So yes, these variations demonstrate that actually knight d4 isn't all that. You know, we can play e3. So anyway, in the game, bishop d4 is played. Knight c3, now knight e7. If king takes g7 here, d takes c6, and this is pleasant for white after queen c2, e3. You can see that after f4, we're getting dynamic play here on the g file, and black has king safety issues. So overall, we are better here. So in the game, we have knight e7, and now e3, and black now plays bishop takes c3. We have a bishop now without a counterpart. This amplifies our bishop. How do we want to take it? I'm prompting you that we should take it with the bishop. But actually, how do you think Magnus took it? But even before we get into that, hold on a second. If black had played to, b6, then we can escape with knight h5. Bishop g4, we have bishop e2. That protects our queen and protects h5. So this position is absolutely nice for us. If bishop e5, knight h5, again, bishop g4, bishop e2. Here, if knight takes h5, yeah, then we just take, no problem, f3. We're going to be better here. This is just a fantastic position to have. So anyway, in the game, bishop takes c3. So how does Magnus Carlsen take in this position, the recapture? What do you think he played? Okay, for 100 points. Yes, you take like this. We want to be able to protect our d5 pawn. So the knight is given up. We're a piece down. Magnus is a piece down. It's much better than bishop takes, because black could take and then take on d5, and white's advantage is only small, if anything. But d takes is much better. King takes, and now here, if knight e takes d5 instead, then the knight escapes. Bishop g4, we have bishop a3 check, as well as bishop e2, but we'll look at bishop e2 in a moment. Knight g7 check, queen d4, and this is great for white. But there's also the plain vanilla bishop e2 again to our rescue. So anyway, in the game, king takes g7 was played, and now c4. So what has white got for the piece? Well, we do have an amplification or magnification of this bishop. This is a very thematic looking piece sacrifice as far as our opening is concerned. We have potentially threats like g4 on the horizon. Black's king has been compromised. What really amplifies this bishop is the structural damage and king safety issues as well of the king, and it sits on a dark square. We have knight g6 being played. So there is compensation for the piece here, even though it's only white has all the pawns, every single pawn, 8 pawns versus 6, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2 pawns for the piece, but it's the bishop pair. So knight g6, if h5 here, queen d4 is strong, and then queen takes e4, it's 3 pawns basically for a piece, and this is a magnificent position. If c6, queen d4, knight g6 to protect f6, d6, and we've got other compensation. We've got loads of pawns now, and this, as you can imagine, is very, very good for white. We can even take here, check. This is just crushing, as an example. Black's not really up to much here, and we're just squishing black. We've got these resources to exploit the pin. It's a crushing position, basically. It's overwhelming. For example, like this. Taking this quite far. But you can see that, even if the bishop leaves the scene, other things happen. So anyway, so c4, the major threat is g4. So knight g6 was played. g4. We have h6. So yes, the power of the pin piece is illusionary. If bishop takes, we have queen takes g4. So h6 was played, h4 to renew the possibility, well, actually, more specifically, not g5 because there's a pin. h5 is very dangerous, as well as queen d4. We have c5, bishop e2, king g8, queen c2. White has enough compensation with the king on the g file here. Rook h7. Now, just to show, if knight takes g4, h5 is strong. For example, knight e7, we're just taking on g4. Queen takes e4. f3. This position is crushing. Queen e5. We can castle queenside. We've got an absolutely devastating attacking position here. For example, d6, knight c8, queen g3, threatening queen g8 checkmate, and we're getting our material back. Now, instead of knight takes g4, if bishop takes g4, we can have h5, bishop takes f6. So yes, let's say bishop takes e2. What would you play here in this variation? Yeah, king takes. Yeah, you want this rook to come to g1. This is really crushing. Knight f8, check. And there's a beautiful tactic here. Can you spot it for 200 points? So it really shows how devastating our bishop on b2 can be on a good day. Yeah, queen takes e4 check. Check all checks, even the outrageous ones. Rook g7. Pardon me, not rook g6. Rook g7. Yes, that would be a terrible mouse slip if you had a mate in one. Is checkmate. So that's checkmate there. So yes, there are many beautiful variations here. So it's a good idea for black not to take on g4, it seems. So we have rook h7. Nonetheless, white's attack persists, and now black has nothing really better than to take here. h5. This is a really violent attacking position. Queen takes e4, f5. The queen drops back. Knight takes f2. Rook hg1 check. King f7. Rook d f1. Black is in a world of pain. Queen h4. Now bishop e5, setting up loads of tactical threats. Queen e4. The queens, they stay on the board here, protecting e3 as well, and the bishop. Knight h3, and guess what tactic Magnus employs here, which is the end of the game. White to play for 100 points. Okay, rook g4, and this ends the game. If the game continued with, say, f4, then we can just play rook g takes f4 and win the queen. It's just a crushing position. So yes, Magnus is using an iconic game and finding resources to really much better represent the player that lost. And this is an interesting Grandmaster secret, actually, that, for example, in the London system, there's an epic win of Gatakamsky with an apparent trap in the London system. Players have found resources to show that actually black was okay, and they actually use that as part of their repertoire. Taking an iconic game and finding better representation resources is something to think about. It's in the unthinkable area of devastation, but chess is such, it's an evolving game. We can't underestimate the evolution of chess. When we look and research games, we find improvements. So yes, we can hide things in plain sight of the so-called iconic disaster games. Magnus has taken an iconic disaster game and found that actually, he's put into practice what engines have indicated. That knight f5, even if it gives white treble pawns in some of the variations, this is actually a playable line. He's beaten Alexander Grischuk with it. Grischuk is not a bad player. He's one of the top super grandmasters in the world today. So this line is also playable. So we see that this whole, flavour, the Fischer flavour, who in 1970 vindicated Larsen as well with 5 key wins in this line with c4, is actually a rather playable line. the resources are there to be found, as well as the blunders are there to be found, as Taskua says. The resources for improving iconic disaster games are often there to be found. And Magnus is showing that we don't have to have this terrible temptation to double the pawns. Knight f5 actually does align, if you think about it, with the notion of amplifying and magnifying this bishop on b2 to show how devastating it can be, especially with the kings around there in conjunction with the g-file. We get a common, killer common squares on the dart squares. That's another amplification strategy or celebration strategy of this bishop. If it finds support with other resources on the g-file, that's even better. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this game and you are inspired by this game, and you might even choose this very cheeky variation. Okay, if it's good enough for Magnus Carlsen, maybe it's good enough for the rest of us, especially if we analyze it carefully. Okay, thanks so much.